Okay, everybody, we're going to go through a little sample program I wrote here, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand how to use Eclipse for debugging, and that's one of the best tools for using an IDE. The reason we use it is because it's going to have all these cool debugging features that's going to help us find problems with our code. And for this, I'm going to use some sample code here, and I know it has some errors in it, and so maybe you already see the problems off the bat, but I'm going to show you how to walk through it and how to systematically think about how to solve a problem. Because debugging really isn't just pressing a couple buttons and then magically you'll understand where the problem is. You have to think about what your program is doing, and the debugging tools are going to help you see when what you think should happen doesn't match what is actually happening. So let's open up Eclipse. You can get this sample code up and type it in, so you can pause the screen now and copy this in. There's a little bit extra code, so you can pause here and type this in. And then you can optionally also pause here and enter in this chunk of code as well. Okay, so now that you've done that, hopefully you have it in Eclipse, and if you hit run, we can just start it at the beginning. We can see that it gives us an error right off the bat. So clearly we have something going on wrong in here. Does it give us something helpful? You know, it says exception in thread main. Okay, array index out of bounds. What does that make me think? That makes me think we're probably trying to access some index that is invalid. So index 3 of bounds for length 3. Okay, that's still kind of confusing, so we'll have to think about that. But it says it's at line 16, and that kind of makes sense. This is basically the only line we're accessing the indices of our rows and of our array. So it makes sense that, you know, that's where the error is. So how are we gonna solve this? And this is where kind of the debugging tools get in. We can get into them. So the cool thing with Eclipse is you can set what are called breakpoints. These are a common thing in a lot of different IDEs. And what they allow us to do is when we're going to run through our code, it's going to let us stop at a particular line, or there's more fancy functionality to let us stop at a particular, you know, set of parameters. We can set a whole bunch of things, but for our purposes here, we can just set it to stop at a particular line. And I think it makes sense. You know, we might as well just stop at the first line of code. So if you look over in the there's a little bit of space to the left of the line numbers. If you double click in that space, you get a very tiny little blue dot, and that blue dot is our breakpoint. And that breakpoint says when the program's running, it's going to say, hey, if we're in debug mode and we hit the line with the breakpoint, we stop what we're doing and we're going to let the programmer take control of what's executing. And so I think when you see it running and when you see it happen, it makes a lot more sense. So what we can do is once we have that breakpoint on our first line of code in the method, particularly in our main method, we can put breakpoints anywhere, but for this example, we're going to do it on the first line in the main method. We can then go to the debug button. It's next to the various other run buttons that you've seen, but this one looks like a bug. So that's kind of our indicator that it's for our debug session. Now it's going to give us some things. If you do get a pop-up, you can just allow access for the JDK, and then it gives us this confirm switch perspective, and you're like, what is this? Well, basically the things we use to write code, you know, I want to see my console, I need to see the package explorer, and there's some extra things like looking at the outline that's kind of nice while I'm writing code, so I know what methods are in the class, or the task list is additional things if you're writing software. But right now we're trying to fix software. We're not necessarily writing new functionality. So the things I want to see are going to be different. And that's the different perspective. And I think once you click switch, because we do want to switch to the new perspective. So I click switch, and now it does look a bit different. Now I can see the variables that are currently running, because that's one thing when my code is executing, I want to know what values my variables are, because usually what happens is they're not the values that you think they are. The other thing is we can see where our breakpoints are, and we can see expressions. This is some other fancy stuff that I won't necessarily get into, but the more power that, you know, these functionalities have, the easier it's going to be for us to find the flaws in our code. So, well, we're debugging, so now what? That's kind of the question. I'm going to shift my view just a little bit because I don't necessarily need to see this side, but I'd really like to focus on my code, and I want to be able to see this variables tab. That's going to be really useful for us. So now that we're in here, we've essentially what's happened is the program started and it got to the line with the breakpoint and it said, okay, let's stop executing and let the programmer take over. So right now the program's in this weird just kind of breakpoint state where it's just waiting for us to do something. And what are our options here? Well, we have a lot of options in the debugger. We could just resume programming with the kind of the play button-esque button up at the top. And resume would basically just say, okay, keep running until you hit another breakpoint. And maybe that's what we want to do. Maybe, once we kind of figure out the problem, then we can just hit run and see if it finishes out, and then everything should work. What else is there? There's the terminate button. That one's self-explanatory. When I hit the terminate button, the program's going to stop. What else is here? We have a step into and a step over and a step return. These are kind of going to be our bread and butter while we're doing our debugging. They're going to let us, if you watch when I click step into, it goes to the next line of code, and I can look in my variables, and essentially it ran a single line of code. That's what happened when I did the step into. Later on, when we kind of have to debug our methods, you'll see step into lets us step into methods, and step over lets us step over method calls, because a lot of the times maybe I don't want to jump into the isPositive method that's written down here. I just kind of want to stay in the main method, in which case I'll use the step over, and we'll talk about that as we go through it. And then lastly, there's the step return. Maybe I'm in the kind of called method and I want to pop back up pop back up to the caller method, in which case I can use the step return. And we'll talk about when those are good times to use them. But right now, let's focus on just using the step into, because that's all we really need for this. And we'll step into our code. So we can see, we stepped into the setting up the array. And it's kind of important to understand how the array, we can see it in our variables. If I click on the little drop down next to the array, I get 3 kind of indexed values. And well, that's a little confusing because I would have thought, oh, why doesn't it just list all the values? But we have to remember it's a 2D array, and 2D arrays are essentially arrays of arrays. So this is the 0th array, which should have values of 1, 2, 3. Let's see if I'm right. Yeah, if I click on that drop down for the subarray, index 0 has 1, and then 2, and then 3. And I can also see it down here. And optionally, I should be able to drop down the first array within our 2D array. That should be the 4, 5, 6, right? So if I click on the drop down, I can see the values 4, 5, and 6 are stored there. So now I kind of have a little understanding of how I can look at what values are currently in my array, and I can drop down whatever array I want. And when we have objects and stuff, that's also going to be really powerful because we can see all the values that are stored within an object. So that's useful. Let's keep stepping. Let's step through our next line of code. We can step into it because doesn't particularly matter. And we can click sum, and we can see our sum value right there. And we have the name, obviously it's named sum, and we have our value, and it's 0. And so at this point, we've set up our variables, and they're exactly how we think. And so this is where we have to start figuring out, clearly, this chunk of code is where our problems are. We said it had something to do with an array index out of bounds, and so likely, we're probably doing one of our loops wrong. So what is this program trying to do, and then how are we trying to do it? So this program, it says it's program trying to calculate the sum of a 2D array, and then it will find whether the value is positive or negative. So what would make sense is this is trying to find the sum of all elements in the array. Okay, that makes sense. And it makes sense that we're using 2 for loops to do it, because we need one for loop to loop through one index, all the rows, and we need another for loop to loop through all the columns within those rows. So that kind of makes sense. So let's see if we can think about what each line of code is doing, and then see if our variable values reflect what we think that code should be doing. So our for loop, this first one on line 12, the looping through all the rows, well, it should loop through row 0, row 1, row 2, and row 3. So that's what we should hope. And then from there, each for loop within that for loop will loop through each column. And there should be 3 columns in each row. So it should loop through values 0, 1, and 2. And so now that we know what our program should be doing, we have to check if that's what it is doing. You have to be kind of proactive. There's a lot of the times you kind of feel like you just want to keep clicking through the step into or the step over and just keep clicking and see what happens when your program's going. But you need to be proactive when you debug. You don't want to be reactive. If you're reacting to what's happening, you've already missed when the problem happened. But if I'm watching my code and I see, oh, it doesn't set the value that I thought it should, then I already know where the problem is. And that's really how you debug. It's about making sure you already know what should be happening, and then checking with the debugger tools if that's what's actually happening. So let's leave a little comment for ourselves. So our row should loop through, it should loop through values 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? Because there's 3 rows. And if we think about our column should loop through, well, what should it loop through? It should probably loop through values 0, 1, and 2, because there's 3 columns and then there's 4 rows. Okay, so now that we're here, we can kind of keep stepping into the code. So I can click step into, and it's going to go that next line. Okay, that's cool. And we can see our row value was set up accordingly. Row is equal to 0. So we're already kind of starting off with what we think it should be. Now what's the next line of code going to do? Well, it's our for loop. And since it's the beginning of the for loop, it should hopefully set up our column variable, and it should set it to 0 as well. So let's see if that's what happens. Let's step into it, and we see, okay, it's set to 0. That's awesome. Okay, so it looks like we're doing pretty good. And now we should see it adds the value of array 0, 0, because we're at row 0, column 0. And we can actually check what that value is within our variables window. So if I go to array 0, 0, it should add the value 1 to our sum. So let's see if that's what happens. Let's click on the step into, and we can see it. The nice thing about this is it is highlighted, what variable changed. I can see that my sum variable changed from a value of 0 to a value 1. So our program's working exactly how we think it should, at least so far. And that's good. If we know what the program should do, and then that's what it does, then hopefully our program isn't running into errors. So let's keep looping through and see if we can find the problem. So what's next? So we just incremented the value of sum. So hopefully our next line of code that we're going to run is the incrementing our column value and checking if it's less than the array length to make sure that it's the right index. So I'll step into it again, and we can see the column value incremented to 1. Okay, that's exactly what we hoped for, because now we're looping to the next column, and so now we should add the value 2 to our sum. Okay, there it is. The value of sum went from 1 to 3 because we added 2, which was in 0, 1 in our array. So let's keep going. What's the next value of column? Well, it's probably going to increment again, so we should get 2, and then we'll go from there. So let's see if column increments to 2. So let's step into it. Column incremented to 2, and so now we should add the next value of our array, which is 3, to our sum. So our sum should go from 3 to 6. Let's see if that's what happens. It goes from 3 to 6. So right now, essentially everything's working so far. We've looped through our column. We've looped through values 0, 1, and 2. So what's the next thing that should happen? Well, we should go back and increment our row and then start at column 0, right? That's what we think should happen. Let's see what happens. Oh, it changed the value of column. Why did it do that? Well, we thought that it should go to the next row, which would have been row 1, and then it would reset the column from there. But it didn't. Why didn't it do that? Well, let's look, what would be the causes for that? Well, if I think about why a for loop would continue, it has to be based on this expression here, our terminating condition. And if I look closely at it, well, array.length is actually telling us the number of rows, but we wanted to loop through all the columns. So what do we do to loop through all the columns? Well, really, we should be looping through array 0. I could also put array row.length, where I get whatever row we're on, I'm going to take the particular length of that row, which is the number of columns in it. So now we've looked through our code, we've stepped through it until it gave us an error where it essentially didn't tell us what we thought it should. And then this column 3, if we think about what that's going to do, we're going to try and access array 03. And array 03 doesn't exist, and that's what would give us that error. And so now, because we took the time to step through our code and think about when our code isn't doing what we think it should, we can figure out where the problems are. So I'm going to, since we fixed it, when you make a change to your code, it's not going to automatically update, because we have to remember the code's compiled and then it's run. And so right now I made a change, but it hasn't been compiled yet. So we need to stop by hitting the terminate button. So now we've stopped our code. I can save this updated code and we can run it again. And this time I'm going to again step through it. I'm going to go through it a little bit faster since we took the time to go through it slow so that we could find the problem, and now we can go through it a little bit faster. Don't race through your code and then all of a sudden it'll break and you won't know why. We still need to take the time and think about what we're doing. So let's continue. Let's step into this. We see our array is set up. That's cool. We see our sum is set up. That's correct. Now we should see the row and column being set up with both values of 0, and that's what we see. Okay? And now we're going to start incrementing our sum value by various values in our array. So why don't we open up what we should be summing? We should be summing 1, 2, and 3. So if I step into it, we added the value 1, and then we'll increment column. And then we're going to add the value 2, which gives us a sum of 3. And then we're going to increment the column again. Now we're going to add the value of 3 to sum, which is what happens. Now it's 6. And then we're going to increment what? What should happen here? Well, our column is 2. So hopefully we should be ending this for loop and we'll be incrementing our row. So let's see if that's what happens. Did we fix the problem? So if I step into it, look at that. Our column value, well, why? Okay, now it no longer exists. Isn't that kind of weird? But actually, when you think about it, it makes sense. Now we've stepped out of this for loop so that we could increment our row value again. And the column value only exists within these two braces, within the scope of this for loop. And so now when we increment our row value, which is what we hope should happen next, then we can go in and we can create our column value again. So let's see if this is what happens. Our row value should now go to 1. And that's what happened. Perfect. And now I have a lot more confidence in my code, and so I can step through this a little bit quicker. I know that I'm going to increment my sum value, and then I'll increment my column, sum, column, and now this column number is 2. And so hopefully we should be going back and incrementing the row. So we incremented sum, and let's see if we increment the row value now. Okay, we're back up here, and boom. So we see our row value got incremented to 2. That's exactly what we wanted. And so now we can keep stepping through, because I'm pretty confident at this point it doesn't have any errors, because I've stepped through it, pretty precisely. Okay, and now our row value is 3, but when it was 3, we were going to increment it, which makes it 4, and then we won't check that value. So that gets us into that. And so let's check this last is sum positive. You know what? I'm pretty confident this is going to work. So why don't we stop this and let me add a system.out print statement, because I feel confident that my code is going to work. And then we can talk about what happens. So I can add my system.out.println. And you know what? I might just is some positive. Let's hope I spelled it right. Yeah, I did. And let's just hit run. So it's going to skip through all the breakpoints and just go right to the bottom. And if we were watching and do a little bit of common sense thinking, we know the sum of all these values is going to be positive. So hopefully it prints true. Let's see if I did this right. Oh, it prints false. I guess I shouldn't have been so confident in my code. Well, we know now that our for loop is working. So I don't need to step through that again. So what I did, if you notice, I went back to where that breakpoint was and I double clicked on it to get rid of it, because we don't need to step through all this again. Let's just go through the part we need to go through. So on line 22, where I do this check, I'm going to add a breakpoint right there. That breakpoint's going to let me stop the code right there, and then from there we can jump into this method. So now that we've added the breakpoint, we can hit the debug button, and hopefully it'll run all the way to there, and it's already calculated the sum. It's the same as last time. That's perfect. And now this is where we have to think about the step into, step out of. We have to step into this method because somewhere in our isPositive method we're going wrong. So let's step into it. So we stepped into it. What does it do? Well, we're passing it our sum, okay? If sum is less than 0, we're going to return true. But if we think about this, isPositive, oh, well, one, I can quickly look at this. But let's also step through it just to see what happens in terms of the debugger. So obviously our sum is greater than 0, but we want it to return true. But if we watch what happens as we step through the code, we'll see that's not what's going to happen. So our number right now is greater than 0. We can see it's 51. And so if I step into this, it's going to jump down to the else clause and start executing. And why did it do that? Well, because sum isn't less than 0, so it's going to jump to the else clause, in which case we're going to return false, and we're going to continue to step into. And so now we've jumped back, and the isPositive returned false. Okay? And so if I go to the next line, is sum positive is false, and so there was a problem in here. And obviously, if we think about it, it should be if num is greater than 0 is when we return true, because numbers greater than 0 are positive. And what's the other thing here? And then this is something I kind of have to point out, because if I don't, you'll get very concerned, because I know I do. When we get to our print line statement, we don't want to step into it. But if you do happen to step into it, you'll notice like all of a sudden we get into some print stream class, and you might accidentally keep clicking on it because you were going too fast through your debugging. This is where we can kind of talk about the step into, step out of, step through. So I stepped into it, and that's going to keep calling methods. But really what I want to do is we have the step over. So that's what I would have probably preferred to do back in main. I didn't need to step into print. I just kind of needed to step over it. And then the step return is, oh, well, now that I'm here, I kind of want to leave. And so the step return lets me jump back up one method call, in which case we've done our print statement and it printed false. But now we've updated our code. So let's terminate this. Let's save our code. We can close out of the print stream class because we don't need it anymore. And now, hopefully our code is running correctly. So I'm just going to hit the debug button again. I'm going to stop it at this breakpoint here. And you know what? I don't really feel like I need to check the isPositive method again. I think we fixed the problem. So why don't we just step over it and see if it worked? So I can step over, which basically ran through this entire method call, stepping over the method. And we see isPositive return true, and that's what we wanted. So we can actually step over our print statement as well. Let's see if, oh, I think I clicked step into. So let's step return, because we don't want to step through this anymore. We can return back to the main method, and we're done, and it returned true. So now we fixed our code. It does everything we think it should. And so to finally kind of clean this up, we can jump back over. If we look in the top right and you hover over, you can see there's a debug and a Java view. These are our perspectives. If you remember when we open this up, we can jump back to our Java perspective, which is the one you're probably used to, and we can hit run, and now everything works like normal. So that was it. We've gone through and we figured out how to debug our code. So why don't I just run through the main steps again so that we make sure everybody kind of knows what all was going on. So first, we set a breakpoint and we ran it in debug mode. And when we were in debug mode, we switch to the debug perspective. This debug perspective lets us see variables in the variables window, and we can see our code, and we can from there step into our code to step into methods and step one line at a time through our code. We could step over code if we want to step over a method instead of jumping in and calling it. And then we can step return, which is when we're in a method, we can return back to the method that called it. And then while we're in this debug mode, the stepping through our code lets us see what the values actually are as the program is running. And this gives us a lot of power because when our program isn't doing what we think it is, we can step through and see what it actually is doing. And this allows us to take a proactive step in our programming and a proactive step in our debugging. So what we did to solve a problem is we thought about what the program should do, line by line, and then we checked if that's what the program actually does. In this case, our column value was looping one too many times, and that's because our condition was incorrect. And the only reason we caught that was because we took it one step at a time, thought about what the code should do next, and then checked one line at a time if that's what it's doing. And that's what we need to do every time we fix a problem, is to go through it nice and slow and check and make sure each line is doing what we think it does. And that means thinking about what it's about to do before we actually step through it. Once we fix that problem, we could stop our program, fix the necessary problems. Maybe we could change where our breakpoints are so that we're not having to sit through everything, especially if we already know a piece of code works as we think it should. And then from there, we can keep going with that idea of saying, okay, what should this line of code do next? And then see what it actually does and compare if that's the correct thing it should have done. So hopefully this was helpful. I know that there's a lot going into debugging, and it really is kind of a process. You kind of need to step through it, pun intended, on your own. So I hope that was useful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.